Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Kenya 2022 Elections Risk Monitor webinar. My name is Rob Walker. I'm the Head of Research and Information Services at SF Group, and I'll be today's host. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you all, to see so many attendees and also to see some familiar names from our client base, from former colleagues, and I suspect probably some people who operate in the same space as us as well. I'd like now to introduce this afternoon's speakers. So first of all, we have Teresa Ngunjiri, who is our lead analyst for Kenya, and she heads a small team who will be focused on the elections in the coming weeks and months. Also, Taka Lwandi, who is our regional manager for Africa, in charge of our information services team, and responsible for all of the output that we produce for Kenya, but also for the other countries that we monitor closely in Africa. Dylan Evans is our director of Africa for SF Group, who's in charge of all of the operational delivery across the continent. And finally, we hope to be joined at some stage by Conrad Thorpe, who is our CEO. Just as I'm normally based in London and at the moment in Nairobi, Conrad is normally in Nairobi and is currently based in London. And so it's possible he's between engagements, having been delayed on flights. So that will be potentially a vulnerable part of the webinar. So I'd appreciate if there's a period of silence that you bear with us, because he will be worth listening to. I'll now take you through the agenda for the morning. So first of all, we will cover off the timeline, so where we are at the moment, and then looking ahead through the electoral cycle, particularly focused on potential flashpoints for violence in time and space. Then Teresa will lead on an explanation of why, to use the old cliche, this time is different. You will all be aware there are several novel features of this cycle, and it's important for us all to understand how they contribute to stability. Taka will then look ahead on the timeline beyond the known dates to outline some of the potential unpredictable developments that we've been looking at, which could generate uncertainty and instability, and therefore the points that all good contingency plans should make provision for. Dylan will then talk about how SF Group has supported clients in previous election cycles and how we're preparing to support them through this one as well. And then, technology permitting, Conrad, who has experience of decades worth of electoral cycles, including supporting clients directly on the ground, will contribute some of his personal views. Then finally, we'll move to a question and answer session. So first of all, a quick look at the elections timeline. So this slide should be familiar to people who've read our pre-elections risk reports. Small and large explosions represent key dates on which we expect disruption or unrest. And the larger the explosion, the more the unrest that we're expecting. Note that we're now in late May, only days away from the start of the formal campaign. Although I have to say, driving around Nairobi at the moment, you would definitely be forgiven for thinking that the campaign was in effect already underway. There are huge posters everywhere. People are talking about it on local media, on social media, and obviously in the local and international press. We then move into a period, once the campaign kicks off on the 29th, we move into a period of the official confirmation of nominations for various contests, county and constituency level. And all registrations for all candidates need to be complete by the 24th of June. The campaign itself ends in early August, and polling day is on the 9th. Note right at the top of the slide, and there is a small explosion that says Ruto VP court case. And that refers to the possibility of a legal case unfolding in that period sometime in June, and we will talk about that later in the presentation. Once the polling day is complete, there will be a counting period and certification of the results, with the results themselves due not before the 28th of August. The counting period to the 29th of August. At that point, we will have, hopefully, a decisive winner. But in the possible case where there is no clear winner, or that a successful challenge is launched, there will be a period in which people can make representations. The Supreme Court will then hear those representations not before the 5th of September. They then have 14 days in which to consider those appeals, and then have to make a decision sometime shortly after those 14 days are up. Then a runoff election has to be held within 60 days. And so if you crunch the numbers, we've calculated that give or take 24 hours or so in either direction, a runoff election has to be held not later than some point in the middle of November, so probably around the 16th. It's very likely, although it's not certain, and we'll talk about that later, that everything will be concluded by late November. So that's the timeline. And at this point, I'll now hand over to Teresa, who will take you through what's different about this time.
All right, so moving on to some of these unique features we've identified in these elections. This is in comparison to previous election cycles, that's in 2013 and 2017. So first off, we have testing of the 2010 Constitution. As it has come out clearly in this year's poll, it is both a game of the constitutional requirement for an increase in representation of the female candidates. And so the IEBC has continually pushed political parties and coalitions to ensure that candidates are fielding their campaigns with their parties conform to this requirement. And also in the presidential bid, we've also seen quite a number of female candidates. And in the two leading coalitions, the naming of a deputy president as a female nominee. Then another factor is the naming of the cabinet nominees and the first order of business. This was evident on May 16th when both leading coalitions identified both of their deputy president nominees, with the deputy president, outlining his first order of business if he's elected in office is to focus on economic revamp and championing his bottom-up economic model, which has been his main campaign strategy. And then his main opponent, that is Raila Odinga, also coming out clearly in pushing out for more constitutional reforms, with assigning his deputy nominee constitutional mandate as soon as if he's elected in office. Then the two DP nominations, which focused on naming candidates from the Mount Kenya region, which has come out as a main swing vote. This is given that one of the largest tribes, that is the Kikuyu ethnic tribe, is based in Mount Kenya, largest in terms of population and largest in terms of registered voters. So the area will come out as a big swing vote, and both leading coalitions are pegging much of their campaigns in that area. We've seen that in the past 2 weeks with the two parties focusing their campaigns in Nyeri and the wider central region, that's Laikipia and Nyandarua counties. Then other issues that come into contention is the ICT capabilities. That's with the electoral body, that's the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission, the ICT Authority, as well as the Communications Authority. Some of this goes from the 2017 elections, such as the infamous missing of servers, which largely influenced the determination of the 2017 Supreme Court case, which led to a rerun. We've seen quite a number of accusations and concerns across social media, especially on cabinet secretaries heading some of these ministries, such as the ICT Authority, being involved in active campaigns, while constitutionally some of these principles are tasked with focusing on the professional side of things and keeping out of active politics. So some of the political actors have accused some of these authorities of bias and external influence. So this will be a main note to look at as we head into the polls. There's also the issue of the 4G network rollout across polling stations, with reports of delays in terms of accessibility of networks, and which may or may not affect the relaying and tallying of results. Then there's also increased penetration of social media. This refers to the recent regulations that have been put in place by institutions such as the National Cohesion and Integration Commission. This is cracking down on hate speech. We've also seen the Director of Public Prosecutions come out clearly with curbing some of these incidents we've seen, pointing out to politicians, being involved in instances of hate speech during campaigns. However, there remains concern because with news reports coming in with the DPP saying they will not be actively prosecuting hate speech cases until after the polls are concluded. So this will be one of the key things to watch. Then there's the issue of opinion polls, which continue to shape up the political landscape, especially on social media. Week in, week out, different institutions, media stations have issued different and varying results of conducted opinion polls. Some politicians have disagreed, while some have indicated they will run their own independent polls. However, it remains unclear whether they will be relayed via social media or conducted via other platforms. Then moving on to the security side of things, we've been able to trace some of electoral violence incidents. This is in the past 5 months, and have a representation of the past 5 months or so, with some of the hotspot regions being, coming out evident in Nairobi, Kisumu, and Uasin Gishu areas. Most of these incidents were recorded throughout the political party nomination exercise that was conducted in April. And then a comparison between the last election cycle, that is in 2017 and 2022, we've seen quite a constant trend with some of these hotspots, that's in major cities such as Nairobi, Mombasa, Kisumu, and will likely escalate maybe before or after the polling exercise is complete. So I will hand over to my colleague, Taka, who will take us through some of the wildcards.
Thank you, Teresa. So following Teresa's profile of the elections, a number of outliers have emerged. We're terming these as variables. They lie under the wildcards category. So our first category of fixed variables, these can occur unexpectedly during the campaign season or immediately after polling on the 9th of August. These are generally not affected by political developments or the environment. The other category are dependent variables, these whose probability and impact and significance shift with the political environment and the landscape from the start of campaign season running through to the polling on August 9th, as well as a possible runoff if there is one. Beginning with the fixed variables, we identified 4 different ones. We have the significant mass casualty attack, unexpected death of our main candidates, which Teresa mentioned, presidential candidates, which Teresa highlighted as Ruto and Raila, as well as the third being IEBC to postpone the elections and Kenyatta to seek a third term. Under these, for the significant mass casualty attack, there is a low historical precedent for this. This would be Al-Shabaab or similar threats emerging from armed violence, such as banditry. These groups might try to exploit emerging divisions due to the political landscape. However, like I said, it remains unlikely. Nevertheless, security personnel are expected to ramp up their presence across the regions, as well as targeted areas. So these are flashpoint areas. So there'll be heightened policing, heightened military presence, as well as in the population centers such as Mombasa, Nairobi, and Kisumu. The second point I mentioned was the death or incapacity of any of the main candidates. So this is through health, an accident, or assassination. Of course, in the immediate aftermath of such an incident, there would be a potential for political uncertainty, social unrest, pockets of violence in these flashpoint areas, a mobilization for politically motivated unrest and retaliatory attacks as such. But constitutionally, in the event of a death of any of the candidates, that is a candidate for president, as well as their chosen deputy president, as well as the president-elect, once the IEBC collects its numbers that it needs, the elections would be canceled and a new election would be run 60 days from the intended date. So that would be ideally from the 9th of August, 60 days from then. Moving on to the third point of IEBC postponing the elections, Chebukati, the commission chairperson, has reaffirmed that there will be no postponement of the elections. However, due to recurrent challenges regarding the capability for the IEBC to conduct free, fair, transparent elections, this still remains an open wildcard. The final point of Kenyatta seeking a third term, this is very unlikely. However, we did put that as a wildcard, if fixed, and is not deterred by the political landscape. There is no indication for this. Moving on to our dependent variables, we identified 3 dependent variables. This is Kalonzo Musyoka, the leader of the Wiper Party. His role as seeking a seat for the presidency, he did submit his pre-approval papers on Monday. However, notably, we know that Azimio offered him the role of chief of the cabinet ministers, which is similar to the prime minister role. One can view this as a trade-off given his previous attempts for seeking the high seat in the country, but also it's a position that's not constitutionalized, so it can be reneged at a later date, causing obviously fractions within the Azimio coalition. Regarding the position of the chief of cabinet ministers, it can also be assessed as the consolidation of political power from Raila's camp, consolidation of political power from Ruto's camp, essentially. The next point is Ruto's chosen running mate, which is Rigathi. The DPP has in February pushed for the resumption of a trial against Rigathi among 9 other politicians. Rigathi is under trial for corruption, for economic crimes. This is including money laundering, as well as unexplained assets amounting to $65 million. The DPP was seeking to bring up the hearing from September to June, which would obviously be before the elections, and September would be after the elections. So that is if Ruto wins and Rigathi, gains the position of deputy president. This is in relation to that. However, we have the precedent of the ICC cases against Uhuru Kenyatta and Ruto while they were in office, so there isn't too much of a disruption to it, but it is warranting if the IBC moves to nullify Rigathi's nomination for deputy president. The last variable that we identified was IBC's credibility fluctuating through political developments. So this is through the verification processes, nullification of aspirants, changes to the election calendar, or any requirements for any candidates seeking political seats. So any changes in these from the IBC could be viewed as biased, and it could spark accusatory rhetoric from different parties as well as their supporters. This covers the distinct wildcards that we identified so far. I will now hand over to Dylan Evans, our Director for Africa, to say a few remarks.
Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, to those who are dialing in. This is, as Taka said, Dylan Evans. I have the pleasure of directing our operations across Africa. I'm talking to you obviously from Nairobi. So what I wanted to talk briefly about was where we have added value to clients in the past. I've been with the company now for 2 election cycles. I won't mention 2007, 2008 because I wasn't with the company, and I think that Conrad will probably touch on that far more eloquently than I will. Where I see our value is acting as an important sanity check. We consume news and we have to decode news as it comes in, and then there is always an agenda depending on what we're reading. I think we act as a very good sanity check for organizations and individuals in that space. Obviously, the information services is key. I'm not going to dwell on that, but I think ensuring that you are receiving accurate, timely information, solid analysis is a first step to ensuring that your organizations and individuals are prepared. On the consultancy side of things, where we've come in previously is short-term secondments, ensuring that your policies, procedures, contingency plans are thought through, are in place, your staff are prepared, they feel empowered through things such as training. We can conduct assessments and advisory services based on your operations, your profile, where you are, and generally acting in the space of being proactive. I think if we were to get to a stage, and I should be clear, I don't believe we will get to a stage where we were in 2007, if we get to the stage where we are looking at evacuations and extractions, then sadly I believe that we have failed and organizations have failed, because we should be in a position to act ahead of time. And once the situation deteriorates, it becomes very difficult for us to stretch resources and assist. Of course, we will always be in a position to try. So my sort of message on that side of things would be to be proactive. Look at your procedures, look at your policies, empower your people to act in a sensible way. I don't believe that closing up and departing for extended periods is necessary, certainly not at this stage. So yeah, that would be the area where I would say that we would add the most value and have done over the last 2 election cycles, certainly. I hope to assist with any questions and answers, but I will hand over to Rob while we try and dial in the CEO.
Thanks, Dylan. I've just heard on a different channel from Conrad that unfortunately he's not going to be able to attend this morning. Now he's been unavoidably detained with a client. So unfortunately, I'm going to ask him. I'm volunteering him now. I'm going to ask him to record some of his thoughts separately, and we will distribute those to people who've attended in one form or another, written or video. Depending on his preference. On the plus side, that means we got a bit longer for questions than we would otherwise have had. I'm going to lodge the first question to my team, and it's not a test. Right when we started preparing this report to the elections back in January, obviously the really big difference this time is the fact that you have an incumbent president who can't run again, not supporting his current deputy president, and instead backing a long-time political rival. And the way that is sort of shaped up into this perception that the election cycle is a fight between the old established political dynasties who are trying to stitch up the newer so-called hustlers. And with that in mind, and we alluded to it earlier, the potential court case hanging over Deputy President Ruto's choice of running mate, what is the calculus behind that for the Deputy President? Because clearly, during the middle of election cycle, to have running mate potentially embroiled in a court case doesn't appear to have many obvious payoffs, and obviously a lot of considerable downside. And of course, for this audience, it's significant because of the number of opportunities that a court case would present for unrest, if not wider violence. When you have the announcement potentially of the charges being brought, that's a potential flashpoint. You've then got the court case itself, appearances in person, presumably, and then you've got the announcement of the verdict. So you've got three potential lightning rods for unrest just there. And that doesn't even begin to talk about the electoral payoff. Whoever wants to take this one on, I'd be very happy to throw over to them.
Thank you, Rob, for your question. I think from my perspective and my assessment is that the DPP attempting to bring forward the hearing regarding Rigathi might, of course, cause some rift and obviously accusatory rhetoric. However, I think given in the past having Uhuru Kenyatta and Ruto also at a higher level being under watch from the ICC, I don't think that it's that much of a deterrence. I know that obviously if he'd have to show up in court, so meaning that he doesn't have as much presence on the campaign trail, and we know that he brings a huge crowd to President William Ruto's campaign efforts. We also know that he does have a lot of cash flow that supports the campaign efforts, and if it comes to to an indictment, would obviously deter those efforts for William Ruto. But however, I don't see the IBC pushing forward or intervening rather with the DPP's efforts. And yeah, I think that's my response.
So it's all about resources, basically. It's the resources that the running mate brings. Potentially a high risk decision for the Deputy President. Okay, we've got a question that's come in on the Q&A session. How do you think, if at all, the announcement of running mates shifted potential hotspots for violence? And if it has, how?
Yeah, so in my own opinion, this is Teresa speaking, I think it shifted in terms of civil unrest. For example, in terms of Tharaka Nithi, we saw quite a number of civil unrest when the DP declined to nominate Kindiki Kithure, who was also one of the leading appointees. So in terms of regions, yes, it refocused some of the identified hotspots such as Nyeri County and the larger Mount Kenya region to others. However, there are others that remain constant, such as Kisumu, Nairobi, Mombasa, and the Western region, which is now up for grabs by either of the candidates, as well as the Eastern region, following the fallout between Kalonzo and Raila's Azimio La Umoja coalition.
Great, thanks very much, Teresa. Okay, just moving on to the next question. Is it SF's assessment that the words and phrases released by the NCIC is accurate, comprehensive enough, and will we see it expanded in the run-up to the election?
In my own opinion, I don't think the list is exhaustive enough, especially when it comes off with some of the tribes which had some of the names listed on there, which left out some outside. And I think there are other coded lexicons that were left out, and it could expand with the dates leading towards the election. And some of these were also dispelled as more of trending words rather than hate speech geared type of lexicons. So yeah, it might expand as we head towards the poll date.
I suppose it's an interesting point because it can't ever be complete because language evolves, and of course once you try to constrain it in one way, it has this habit of popping up. It's a bit like parents trying to understand what their children are talking about, or the police trying to understand what criminals are talking about. Not that they're direct analogies, but language evolves in response to those kind of pressures. So I would think it would be very unlikely that it wouldn't evolve further. And of course, that poses a really interesting challenge for social media companies trying to police it, and of course, organizations like us trying to stay at pace with the way the language is changing. So it is a really interesting question. Thanks, Teresa. A question here. Ruto has pushed the election away from the historically tribal agenda and is now focusing on the dynasty hustler platform. for his run. Previously, tribalism has been held accountable for a lot of the political violence. How do you think this changes? Does the change in focus affect the likelihood of electoral violence?
I feel with the announcement of Martha Karua as Raila's running mate, I think that is actually positioned Raila as the candidate for change. I think the sort of dynasty hustler ticket is less credible now. I think Martha Karua is massively credible. Raila is aging. I think 2 terms is probably unlikely, if even a full term. So I think the prospect of having someone like Martha Karua in the position of president is actually really exciting. With regards to violence and tribalism, I don't know how much it has shifted. I think it's shifted. We still have politics of identity in this country. I think it is moving away, and it's certainly leagues further on than it was perhaps in late 2000s. But it is still a defining factor. And I think, if tensions do escalate and we do see flashpoints, they will still be along ethnic lines, undoubtedly. I don't think we can move away from that. So I don't see it as a definite shift. I don't know if anyone else has any different or addition to that.
Given that the DPP has put the prosecutions for hate speech on hold, is there a possibility that the decision would result in a call for violence, and that possibly shared on Meta platforms? I would say that one of the challenges, which we did address in the most recent pre-election risk report, is the fact that if you say to someone that you're not going to prosecute at the point of the offence being committed, then the moral hazard is reduced. And I'm not saying you're encouraging people to talk and write irresponsibly, but it doesn't have the deterrent effect that it would have if you said we would investigate. I mean, it's a very difficult question for NCIC and the machinery of government to navigate, because having put these terms out there and saying they're forbidden, you then kind of got to take action, but taking action during an election campaign is going to be fraught with difficulties. Teresa Tucker, did you want to add anything on that point?
I don't think so. I think I agree with Rob. I think it, like you said, a deterrence. I think it's in terms of accountability. I think it opens the floor for people to increase hostilities and incitement without regarding the role that they play, especially if you're vying for a higher seat or if you hold a higher position politically. I think it loses accountability, and maybe playing back to, I think, what Dylan was talking about regarding identity politics, the floor remains open. I think it'll also be very interesting to see what kind of judicial support the commission gets once the elections are over and once they start running through, okay, who said what when they said it, does it still hold weight in courts, etc.
Great, thanks, Taka. I mean, I think also we mentioned earlier, this is a good example of the pressure on language, which encourages it to develop in, like evolutionary pressure on language, if you like, that it encourages it to develop in a different way. So you say you can't use these terms because they're offensive to a certain grouping, and then you find a different way of saying the same thing that is understood by your supporters. So it's an interesting kind of like natural selection process, I suppose. The next question is, could you elaborate on your worst case scenario for this election? We've been looking at the possible outcomes for quite some time, and I think in terms of the worst case, just to take the political dimension out of it, I think the worst case really is one that contributes to uncertainty, and so a lack of a decisive result the first time around doesn't necessarily contribute to a decisive result in a runoff. I think there are also questions you've already heard Teresa allude to, concerns around the election infrastructure, the ICT, the reliability of that infrastructure, and also the popular sentiment, the enthusiasm for engagement. And so I think from my perspective, leaving who wins, who loses out of the question, the worst case scenario is one that drags on with no decisive result and contributes to the sort of the disengagement or even apathy that some opinion pieces have spoken about. Moving on to another question, what will the effects in the Kisumu region be, having seen the highlights in the heat map so far? Will the accumulation of incidents in that region to continue or even intensify?
Kisumu is one of the major hotspots, especially when election season is ongoing. going by what we've seen so far with the different electoral violence incidents going on, we will likely continue, and especially with coalitions or parties that are not pegging on the region as their main strongholds, we might see some opposition. And this may be in terms of, civil unrest, which is what we've seen majorly during some of these political rallies. So this could continue, and especially now that we're just heading into the official campaign season, and as parties continue to increase their coverage in the region. So this might likely increase.
Thanks, Teresa. So good, interesting question. So since Mr. Ruto picked Mr. Rigathi as his running mate, do you see that as contributing to a shift of people from Ruto to a different party or coalition?
I think it might lead to a shift, although not significant, given that Rigathi is one of the major kingpins in the area. He is a mobilizer. That's one of the main factors that contributed to him being nominated as a DP. And then also, given that, Martha Karua is also from the Mount Kenya region, some of the votes might be transferred to her party. So there will be a shift, although I don't think it will be quite significant.
Okay, thanks, Teresa. Quite a tactical question now. What will the impact on movement and traffic disruption in Nairobi during the campaign period? How's that likely to play out? And do we think there might be curfews?
There will be disruption. There is disruption. Whenever we have rallies, those of us who have been here for previous election days know that it is chaos. So we will have to plan accordingly. I think we're all quite well drilled at flexible working. So, I think that would make sense over that period. At this stage, seeing curfews, I don't predict it, but of course, that it's not impossible. I think as we get closer and as we start to monitor on a sort of day-by-day basis, I think we'd probably give a slightly more detailed answer to that. But yes, there will be disruption across the country, and it's already being witnessed, I think, in lower levels.
So to add to that point, of course, the election risk monitor product is designed to update on those kind of things. The daily update will focus on what's happening in the next 12 to 24 hours, and then our weekly update will give you an insight into the main election-related activity for the weekend and the coming week. So there are means of helping you navigate those kind of incidents. The next question: what are some of the expected post-election judicial challenges, and will these result in prolonged post-election violence? That's a very good question, and it sort of touches on my point earlier about the worst case scenario. Because clearly the less decisive the result is, the more scope there is for challenge, and particularly if there's no decisive result around a runoff, what do you do? Do you have a runoff for the runoff? Does it boil down to a Supreme Court decision about who is actually the victor? And that itself is going to be, I would imagine, highly contentious.
What I think is likely in line with this is longer the uncertainty, the more scope there will be for escalation. And we've witnessed from terrorist attacks to previous elections, there are malcontents who thrive on spreading fake news. So somebody's going to call cheat. Let's just say it as it is. That will create space for misinformation, disinformation, which will undoubtedly spike and will be allowed to fester or escalate the longer the period of uncertainty.
Does anyone want to disagree with that? No, there's lots of head shaking at the moment. But I've got one final question. When I was growing up, the only country that had a deep state was Turkey. And now it seems that pretty much everyone needs to have one if you're a vibrant democracy. And the idea of a deep state seems to have gathered pace, I think, certainly in the North Atlantic space since around about 2016. And it does seem that there is an analogous discussion or debate here in Kenya around the dynasties and hustler dialogue. Are we seeing, accusations of there being a Kenyan deep state? And if so, what does it mean?
I would say, I think first the conversation of deep state obviously emerged after the handshake and obviously gained more momentum once Uhuru officially gave his endorsement for Raila Odinga as his successor, essentially. And so tying into the dynasties and hustlers, the deep state, in this particular framework, we would of course refer to the Kenyatta and maintaining resources, control over resources post him being leading the country and being the chief and commander of this country. So opting to choose someone who also has, roots in terms of the foundation of the country, sharing mutual interests and securing those mutual interests. That is my response to the answer of the deep state.
Thank you, Taka. What I'd like to do now is, before I hand the floor for some final thoughts back to Dylan, is just cover off a couple of admin points from now onwards, which are some of the next steps related to the service. So we hope to make the recording of this webinar available from tomorrow. We'll mail the link out to everyone who's registered, not just the people who've attended. We intend to update our elections risk monitor, and we'll be publishing a revised weekly SITREP starting on this Friday, and thereafter we will publish a short weekly, as I said earlier, weekly outlook for the key election events in the coming week. And then that will be complemented by daily updates, which will focus on what's happened recently and then what might happen in the next 24 to 72 hours. And they will be initiated from next Monday for subscribers. If you're interested in subscribing to coverage of the Kenya elections, please email us at info.services. The address, I think, is on this slide. Similarly, if you've got any questions arising from this webinar, then I think we'd be happy to entertain some of those follow-up questions as well. Just as a final point, I'll hand back now to Dylan just for his closing thoughts.
It depends on what optic you look through, and I think that's true with most things in life. And for today, I'm looking on the positive. What is certain, what we know is there is going to be a transition of power. I don't believe that for a second that there will be an attempt by incumbent to change the constitution, to extend his tenure. I believe we will have transition of power, and that is important. That is important for Kenya. That is important for democracy in the region. There will be a fifth president. If we put that into context, Kenya has been independent since 1963, and this will be the fifth president. When we look at our closest comparable country, perhaps you could argue would be South Africa, which has been independent since 1994, has also had, in that short period of time, has had 5 heads of state. So, perhaps maybe playing into the concept of the deep state, which I'm not going to go into. So there will be a transition of power. There will likely be a transition of ethnicity of presidency, which is important. And to say otherwise is a fallacy. And that is the only things we know. Anything beyond that, I think, is speculation. And I think as we get closer, we will analyze and disseminate what we are receiving. There will be disruption. That question has been asked. It's unavoidable. Politics is emotive in Kenya. It is emotive across the region, actually, but especially so here. So there is likelihood for disruption. I drive around Nairobi City this morning and I see development, I see infrastructure going up, I see positivity. At the same time, you see huge problems with corruption, probably more so than I've seen in my 11 years in this country. And that is concerning. Do I believe that Kenya will descend into chaos? I do not believe so. Do we have to be cognizant of the fact that it is a vulnerable, fragile democracy that is highly emotive and is largely driven by ethnicity? Of course we do. It upsets me when I see BBC World News Focus on Africa talk about elections in Kenya and say, quote unquote, it is impossible to think of elections in Kenya without thinking of violence. I don't believe that to be the case. I believe we have a growing and developing democracy, and we will have a transition of power. How smoothly, of course, remains to be seen. But I think Kenya is a beacon in the region and is carrying a huge amount of positivity for the region, but also for the continent as a whole. So I would sort of leave it with that note of positivity. I would encourage you, those of you who are responsible for your businesses, security and safety, to take it seriously and to prepare yourselves. Clearly, I'm going to say that the SF Breathe Kenya 2022 election monitor is a really great way to start. Thank you all for your attendance and your ears and your really useful questions. I will end it there.
Thanks, Dylan, for those closing thoughts. Just a reminder to contact us via Info Services, and thank you very much indeed for your attention and for your very stimulating and interesting questions. And that ends the webinar.